Hi, this is Nadine, the Gluten Free RN. Welcome to the Gluten Free RN podcast. On episode 8 today, we're going to take information directly from the CDC on antibiotic-resistant threats. And I want to talk a little bit about why it's so important to make sure that your intestines are as healthy as they can be. Because believe it or not, that's where your immune system is. So stay with us for episode 8, where we talk about antibiotic-resistant threats and how the health of your intestines actually will make a huge difference in your body's ability to fight off illnesses, viruses, bacteria, and disease. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Gluten Free RN podcast. Thanks for joining me today. And today we are going to talk about antibiotic-resistant threats. And this information is pulled directly from the CDC website. But first off, I'd like to actually thank you for joining me today. And also, really a huge shout out to the Pulse Media Network. This is my team of healthcare podcasters that help the Gluten Free RN podcast be a success. And included in that is Tim Holloway, the production expert, also known as the podcasting guy. Included in that Pulse Media Network, of course, is Keith Carlson, Kevin Ross, and Elizabeth Scalia of RNFN Radio, The Innovative Nurse Show, and Your Next Shift. They are all huge inspirations for me as a relatively new podcaster. So thank you very much for your support and all of your help in setting up the Gluten Free RN podcast. Today on Gluten Free RN podcast, we're going to talk about the antibiotic-resistant threats that should be concerns to every medical professional in the United States and actually worldwide. Because what we're finding out is that our antibiotics are not working very well anymore. And when you hear the term antibiotic resistance or antibiotic stewardship, please pay attention, both as a healthcare provider and somebody that is a healthcare consumer. So anybody that goes to a doctor or a healthcare provider, you really want to pay attention to this because what's happening is our antibiotics just aren't working anymore. Not as well as they used to. A lot of them aren't working anymore, period, because the bacteria are mutating and our antibiotics just are not as effective in fighting disease and bacterial infections. So overall, my concern with the gluten intolerance and celiac disease population especially, and please keep in mind, we have not identified the vast majority of people that are either gluten intolerant or celiac. A lot of practitioners will say, oh, it's only 1% of the population. That may or may not be true. We're still trying to figure that out. So until we actually come up with some solid numbers that make sense, then I have to assume as a practitioner that the numbers are probably exponentially higher than are reported. Currently, it's estimated that 1% of the population has celiac disease, but 30 to 50% of the population actually carries the genes that predispose a person for celiac disease. And those would be the HLA-DQ2 and or DQ8 genes. Now, if 30 to 50% of your population carries those genes, and they are actively eating gluten or wheat, barley, rye, oats, and oats with an asterisk, those are primarily cross-contamination risks with the wheat, barley, and rye. If you take into account that 30 to 50% of the population are gene carriers for HLA-DQ2 and or DQ8, and they are eating grains, then their risk for developing celiac disease is real. It's actually a possibility at any point in their life, at any age, any ethnicity, and certainly with any symptom or with no symptom. So we have to have a high index of suspicion for celiac disease in just about anyone. And at this point in history, I would love it if every healthcare practitioner had celiac disease listed in their differential diagnosis for any symptom that any patient presents with. Because really, it is that varied. Anybody can present with any symptoms at any time, and it can be simple. It can be something like, hey, I have depression, or I'm fatigued, or I keep having this nagging pain in my right hip, or, something's just not right and I'm not sure what it is anymore, or I have this brick in my gut. So people really present with all kinds of different things. Joint pain, that's another biggie, or chronic anemia. Or chronic anemia and taking iron supplements and they still don't get absorbed and the levels don't go up. And somebody has to ask, why are the levels not going up despite taking supplements of iron? And the same thing with vitamin D or zinc or any other supplements that you may be taking, but because of the damage to your intestines, they can't get absorbed. So you have this damage to your intestines. And because 70 to 90% of your immune system is in your intestines, then your immune system is damaged. And please keep in mind that damage to your intestines should be or is considered to be major organ damage. It's not just villus atrophy, it's actually organ damage. And your intestines are a large organ that we rely on as human beings to have all of our nutrients absorbed through our intestines. And also it's, again, the largest part of your immune system. 70 to 90% of your immune system is in your intestine. So if you have a damaged intestine, you also have a damaged immune system. And I've heard several practitioners actually equate your intestines to soldiers. Let's talk about that for a minute. If you have healthy villi and a healthy GI tract or healthy intestines, and your villi are intact, which means they have no damage, then an antigen or something that does not belong in your intestine floats by from something you ate or something you breathed in, and your soldiers, your T cells, because this is a T cell mediated antibody response, your T cells go, hey, look, it's an antigen. And these soldiers have had 8 hours of sleep. They've had their coffee. Their guns are shiny and loaded. And the sky is blue in your intestines. There's no inflammation. So they recognize an antigen and they take it out. Very effective. Your immune system, when it works, is amazing. But on the other hand, if you do have MARSH4 damage, or let's just even say MARSH1, 2, or 3, including MARSH4 damage, and your soldiers at this point have been on a week-long bender. They've been partying it up. They don't have any coffee. They haven't slept. Their guns may or may not be loaded. There's smoke and fire from the inflammation that is in your small intestine or in your colon for that matter. Right now we're talking about your small intestine though. So the smoke and fire and antigens go by. Your T cells go, what do you think that is? And Joe and Bill talk about it a little bit and they can't really see it and they're not really clear about what it is. So they shoot or they don't shoot. And that antigen may or may not go by. And this is how a lot of people end up with multiple allergies to foods that do not make any sense. And also an immune system that is either hyperreactive or doesn't react at all. There are a lot of people I work with that really honestly don't have an immune system anymore. Mostly children, and this is kind of a little scary. We should all be paying attention to this because if a mom has undiagnosed celiac disease, there's a cesarean birth, maybe she can't breastfeed. A lot of those innate and other parts of your immune system that are supposed to get formed at an early age don't. People don't get seeded with good microbiome, and your immune system really is blunted. So a healthy immune system is what we should all be striving for. And it's really easy to maintain it and maintain the health of your small intestines and your body. It's harder to regain it or rebuild an immune system, but it can be done. It just takes some concerted effort in removing the things that are damaging your intestines, such as gluten and dairy. In my case, I remove all grains, including rice and corn. And we'll talk more about the paleo diet and the benefits of that, maybe in the next episode. So today we're going to talk about the antibiotic resistant threats because this is very concerning as a nurse. in the emergency department, which is where I worked for a number of years, 17 years to be almost exact, both as a trauma nurse and as a critical care nurse, we saw a lot of people that were phenomenally ill. We couldn't really pin it on anything. We're like, why are all these people sick? And, flu season and strep throat, earaches. What caused people to be that ill that they actually came to the emergency department? Sometimes it was because their immune system was damaged or not working appropriately. Frequently, unfortunately, a lot of these people with ear infections or strep infections or other infections, that we were pretty good at identifying, would get antibiotics. And what we quickly learned, or maybe not so quickly, because it took us about 70, 80 years of antibiotic overuse to recognize, hey, maybe these aren't just a medication that we should be giving to everybody for every little thing, including ingrown toenails and prophylactically before surgeries. There's perhaps a more judicious use of the antibiotics than we had been ascribing to in the past. So perhaps all those patients, or a lot of those patients that we gave antibiotics to, we actually wiped out some good microbiome along with the bad microbiome. If you don't rebuild your immune system using things like kombucha, probiotics, and I do mean high quality probiotics that don't have any gluten or casein in them, kombucha, fermented foods, things that are alive, apple cider vinegar, anything you can add to your food that actually helps rebuild the microbiome, because it's a large part of your immune system also. What we know about celiac disease is a fair number of people, and it's estimated that in the general population, that 1 in 500 people are IgA deficient, which means they don't actually produce IgA, immunoglobulin A. So their celiac panels can actually not be positive because they can't mount an antibody response. So every person, whenever they get celiac testing, should actually be tested for a total IgA and a total IgG to make sure that their body is actually capable of mounting an antibody response. That should be the first part of any celiac antibody testing that ever occurs. That includes testing through Enterolab or Cyrex labs. Testing for the total IgA and total IgG need to be added on to almost any of the testing for the celiac antibodies. So just make sure that the testing that is done for celiac disease is actually appropriate. Interestingly enough, and this is one of the reasons that my interest was piqued in celiac disease, my antibody test for celiac disease way back in October 2006 was actually negative. And I was not IgA deficient, but my test was negative. My test for DH, or dermatitis herpetiformis, was actually negative also. However, I tested positive for the DQ2.5 genes, and I'm homozygous for those, which means I got a gene from each parent, my mother and my father, so I'm pretty much guaranteed to have celiac disease. Now, the interesting thing is that a fair number of these tests don't come back positive despite the person having celiac disease. I have lots of theories about that. But if you are sick and you have any symptom, especially if you're a gene carrier and you want to feel better, please consider going on a gluten-free diet, at least for 6 months to a year. And I do mean a strict 100% gluten zero, gluten-free and casein-free diet, if not a paleo diet, and see how you feel. That's a clinical trial and it is valid. Now, let's get down. Let's talk about the antibiotic-resistant threats that are in the United States. And this report is actually from 2013, and you can pull it up on the CDC website. It's very informative. They have some really great pictures of what bacteria look like, and it's fascinating. The national summary data, and this is really early in the report, says that there's at least 2 million illnesses from antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and also 23,000 deaths. But if you take Clostridium difficile and you look at that alone, there's over 250,000 illnesses a year and 14,000 deaths. I think those numbers have increased. I know they haven't gone down. We'll have to double check and look at the current data from this past year. Now, I give this talk every once in a while, and I talk about this particular study because it is very important. If you have damaged intestines and your immune system is damaged, then you're more likely to actually get, number one, any of these bacterial infections or any of the other infections, such as ear infections, strep infections, urinary tract infections, yeast infections. You get the idea. So it puts you at a higher risk for developing infections and thereby having to take antibiotics to fight those. So you can see why it becomes a vicious cycle. Now, what we see in the hospitals and nursing homes, and now we're seeing in the general population more and more, is this bacterial infection called Clostridium difficile, or C. diff. It's caused by too many antibiotics, and then a person is exposed to the bacteria either in the hospital, which happens a lot. It's called a nosocomial infection, or in the nursing home, and people will get profuse diarrhea. It is a bacterial infection. It causes the intestines to get very edematous or swollen, and then also causes the tissue then to pull fluid from the body, and it produces this really nasty diarrhea. It causes people to get hospitalized. It's very expensive. $1 trillion is estimated to be spent on Clostridium difficile alone. And that's over and above any of the other medical expenses that these people might be incurring, of course, because they've already been in the hospital or in a nursing home. When this report came out in 2013, I was giving a lecture, an 8-hour lecture in Minneapolis. And I thought, and this actually came over through the newspaper, that there was a carbapenem-resistant enterobacti outbreak on the East Coast. CRE, or carbapenem-resistant enterobacti, is 50% fatal. And it made it into the media because it is 50% fatal. And at that point, it was pretty much localized on the East Coast. It is now in every state of the United States. It remains 50% fatal, and it is increasingly antibiotic resistant. Again, these are just the urgent bacteria that the CDC is concerned about, especially in 2013. There's more of them now in 2017. The other top 3 bacteria is called Neisseria gonorrhea. Now, this is a sexually transmitted disease, but please keep in mind that antibiotics are increasingly not working against Neisseria gonorrhea anymore. There are antibiotics. Some people can take them. Oral cephalosporin, ceftriaxone, zithromycin, and tetracycline. But those medications are not working anymore in a lot of the population. So we have to be very concerned about this because here we have a sexually transmitted disease and people are like, oh, I'm not going to get any of that. I'm pretty safe, but you never know. People are shocked all the time by what they're exposed to. The 3 urgent bacteria that the CDC was concerned about in 2013, just in review, are Clostridium difficile, with at least 14,000 deaths in 2013 for this report, carbapenem-resistant enterobacti, with at this point in 2013, they had 600 deaths, but I'm sure that's gone up exponentially now that it's in every state, and Neisseria gonorrhea. Now, there's ways, again, that we can help protect ourselves from any of these bacteria and our families, because there's more and more antibiotic-resistant bacteria that are floating about. And really, we want to be proactive and help protect ourselves and our families against these bacteria. And let me explain why, as a nurse, this is a major concern for me. Because if you have damaged intestines, but you don't know it, and you can't fix it, your immune system is damaged. And if your immune system is damaged, you're at risk for developing any of these bacterial infections, or at risk for any of the other influenzas or bacterial infections, viruses, all types of things that, your body is susceptible to if you don't have an immune system or if your immune system is damaged. So my goal as a nurse is to make sure that your intestines are healthy and happy and you have an adequate amount of microbiome, and the diversity of your microbiome is really quite diverse, so that you have a better chance of fighting infection. And my ultimate concern is that at some point we're going to be hit with a pandemic or an epidemic of global proportions, because that's the world we live in now. And we will see death like we have never seen it before, because we actually don't know that we're immunocompromised. And if your intestines are damaged, you don't know that you have gluten intolerance or celiac disease because the vast majority of people are undiagnosed. If we get hit with some other virus or a bacteria that our immune system can't fight, then really we will have a huge loss of life. And again, my goal as a nurse is to make sure that I do whatever I can to prevent that, not only for myself and my family, but for the population in general. So everyone's goal is to make sure that their intestines are happy and healthy. And one of the ways we do that is remove the things that are causing inflammation. And the number one things that are causing inflammation, we should all know this at this point, are gluten, dairy, and sugar. So please think about removing all of those things from your diet, at least for 6 months to a year, healing up your immune system, and giving yourself a much better chance of potentially surviving an epidemic or a pandemic, because that is a real threat to our public health. It is actually a public health crisis that we haven't actually identified all these people with gluten intolerance or celiac disease. So please don't be surprised if something big, bad, and ugly happens and people just are not aware. They're taken completely by surprise. How did this happen to us? Why did this happen? Well, really, we can be proactive and help build your immune system by making sure that you have healthy intestines. And that is the goal. We want to make sure that our T cells are happy and healthy and that they've had 8 hours of sleep and they had their coffee and they're well nourished and they can actually recognize antigens and bacteria, viruses that are, really trying to invade our bodies. If they can identify them and say that's a foreign invader, we're going to take it out and we're going to be very efficient at it, that protects our body and really potentially can prevent us from dying. And that is the goal, of course, to remain as healthy and happy as long as possible with our brains intact. So just as a general review, one more time, healthy intestines should be our number one goal because that is your immune system. We have several bacteria that are now identified by the CDC as antibiotic-resistant threats to our health. You want to be aware of those. You can go back and look at the CDC report. There's a lot of great information. Try to avoid antibiotics if at all possible, but sometimes we have to take them for infections that might be, really invading our body and making us sick. And work with your healthcare providers to make sure that you actually need those antibiotics, that you're not taking antibiotics for a virus, because antibiotics don't work against a virus. You have to make sure that you're actually taking them for something that the antibiotics are going to be effective against. So thank you very much for joining me for episode 8, where we have discussed now antibiotic-resistant threats per the CDC, intestinal health and why it's important, and how to build up your immune system, how to repair your intestines to build up your immune system to make sure that you have the healthiest immune system imaginable so that your body can be really, really effective against fighting off bacteria, viruses, yeast infections, any other type of overgrowth that would impact your health. So thank you once again for joining me on episode 8 of the Gluten Free RN podcast. I'm Nadine Griskoyak, and you can find me at www.glutenfreern.com. You can find this podcast at URL glutenfreern/episode 008 on iTunes. And please, if you like this podcast, please leave a review, rate it, tell other people what you think, send me questions, concerns, issues. I want to hear what you think about the Gluten Free RN podcast, and if it's actually answering your questions or maybe making you have more questions. Please keep in mind that I love it when people do their own research. If you want to do research about anything related to gluten intolerance or celiac disease, go to PubMed, or you can just put in your Google search celiac disease and any other topics. So celiac disease, CELIAC, and joint pain, celiac disease and autoimmune diseases, celiac disease, type 1 diabetes, and you will get a plethora of information. If for some reason you have a hard time finding that information, contact me. I am a research guru in everything related to gluten intolerance and celiac disease. That wraps up episode 8. Do your research, contact me, and have a great day.